Next, it's my honor to introduce Erica Chenoweth, Associate Dean of the Joseph Corbel School of International Studies at the University of Denver and Associate Senior Researcher at the Peace Research Institute in Oslo. Best known, as you all know, for the book Why Civil Resistance Works, The Strategic Logic of Nonviolent Conflict, written with Maria Stephan. So be ready for this. It was the 2013 winner of the Gangemeyer Award for Ideas Improving the World Order. Not an insignificant accomplishment, but the winner of the 2012 Woodrow Wilson Foundation Award for the best book. This is the APSA Award. The 2011 award for the best book of the year from the Guardian. So it's a real honor that that she's speaking here today. Several peer-reviewed volumes of Political Violence in 2013, Rethinking Violence, co-edited in 2010 with MIT Press, and a special issue that's excellent with of the Journal of Peace Research in 2013, Understanding Nonviolence. Numerous articles, numerous chapters. What more can we say? So we're going to learn today why civil resistance still works. So.
Good morning. All right, let's see if we can't wrangle technology first. No, the answer is no. Okay, well, first of all, thank you so much, Hank, and for the sponsors and everybody participating. I always feel like an intruder in a way everywhere. When I first started getting my PhD in political science, I realized as a woman I was intruding on a male-dominated field in security studies. And then when I attended my first workshop on nonviolent resistance back in 2006, I realized I was a security studies person intruding on a bunch of people concerned with nonviolent resistance and pacifism and activism. And disciplinary, boundaries sometimes mean that I feel like I'm intruding on Sociology, Social Movements Conference as a political scientist, but I've been very welcomed here, and thanks for including me. I'm going to talk a little bit about a project that's ongoing with Maria. We're kind of exploring refining our argument from our 2011 book and trying to figure out where we're wrong and where we still feel confident in some of our findings. And so what I'm going to do is talk a little bit about what the core finding was from our 2011 book, and then I'm going to talk about some of the ongoing data collection that we are using to update and refine our argument. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about what I see as the three core contentions that people have made about why we're totally wrong and off base. And some of the research, some done by myself and with collaborators, and some done by others that I think are useful to frame a potential response that brings us back to a coherent overall finding. So the basic claim from the book with Maria is, first of all, starting out with kind of defining the scope of our study. What we did was we looked at all of the mass challenges. By mass, we mean at least 1,000 observed participants with maximalist claims, by which we mean system-changing claims where they were trying to either overthrow an incumbent national leader through irregular means, or they were trying to create a new country through territorial secession, anti-colonial action, or self-determination. And what we did then was we looked from 1900 to 2006, which is when we started collecting the data, at all of the mass mobilizations around the world that would fit those criteria. So at least 1,000 observed participants engaged in some kind of coordinated collective action over time toward those maximalist claims. And in doing this, we consulted a few different types of data sources. One was existing databases, which for the armed conflicts was quite easy to find because, political scientists have been collecting data on stuff that blows up for centuries. Well, we've only been around for a half a century, but people before us, historians, also like collecting data on things that blow up. So we have a lot of data on internal struggles of an armed nature back to 1500s, the Corlitz of War data set and the UCDP and other data sets like this. And at the time in 2006, there actually weren't a ton of global sources from which we could glean the data on nonviolent challenges dating back to 1900. So we did an awful lot of research on different historical case studies of country cases. We looked at all of the existing databases that were available on things like protests and strikes and other things. We created a preliminary list that we then circulated among field experts and asked for refinement or assessment of whether these cases were truly classifiable according to our inclusion criteria. And we also asked them to add any cases that they knew about that we left off. And so we came up with, in the end, 323 cases of both armed and unarmed resistance that met this criteria. And what we did is we distinguished between nonviolent campaigns, meaning that the overwhelming nature of the mobilization involved unarmed civilians using coordinated collective action to confront an opponent without physically harming them or threatening to physically harm them. And that contrasted with what we're classifying as violent campaigns, which is when the primary mode of struggle is armed struggle, hit and run attacks, assassinations, street battles, and so forth. And so we also have kind of a middle of the road category where there may have been a combination of methods, and we call that, when it's appropriate, and primarily nonviolent campaign with a violent flank. And I'll talk a little bit about some of what the findings are related to those categories, because that's one of the big objections to our study. So then what we did was we assessed each case as to whether it actually succeeded. And by success, we use a strict criteria that most political scientists would buy, which is that the campaigns achieve what they set out to achieve, that is irregular removal of an incumbent leader, that's extra constitutional, or they achieve independence. That is full-on de jure independence, not just de facto territorial independence, within a year of the peak of their mobilization. And we also said that they had to have had a discernible impact on that outcome, such that, if a dictator died in office of a heart attack, we wouldn't count that as a success, even though one could make the claim there might have been an indirect relationship. So why did we do it this way? There are a couple of reasons why we collected and were interested in this particular population of cases. And the primary reason was, first of all, I was quite skeptical as to the argument that nonviolent resistance could be effective in the most difficult maximalist cases. The other argument was that we didn't think that we could actually collect every challenge in the world from 1900 on unless we kind of sampled the data in a way to where we were really confident that we were comparing apples and apples, so high-risk mobilization against other high-risk mobilization. And we also just feasibly couldn't, the two of us, collect every challenge in the world from 1900 on, which I have since discovered requires about $3.5 million and about 40 research assistants, but we're getting there. So what the core findings were in this study was that between this time period, 1900 to 2006, out of those cases that I mentioned, the nonviolent campaigns tended to succeed twice as often as their counterparts. And we collected data on a number of different characteristics of the data besides just the primary mode of struggle. And what we found is that the nonviolent campaigns just had a massive participation advantage over their violent counterparts. So they were able to mobilize and, in many cases, sustain mobilization of a much larger proportion of the population than violent campaigns. And because of that, there were a number of different political dynamics that they could activate related to their size and the breadth or diversity of the participants they were able to elicit. So the first is loyalty shifts, which Sharon just discussed, which in our preliminary cut of these data, we coded by a fairly blunt measure of security force defection, which includes the different categories that Sharon just mentioned, all under the same phenomenon, which is why we're really excited about any studies that disaggregate what that means. The second thing that large mobilizations can do is that they can kind of leverage the large quantity of participants and their different experiences to produce new tactical innovations that allow them to maneuver around repression or continually stay on the offensive even when the opponent is trying to contain the mobilization. It turns out that nonviolent campaigns are more highly associated with the backfire dynamics that Lee Smithy was talking about. And it turns out also that the larger a campaign is at the beginning, the more likely those backfire dynamics are to take place. And then it's also the case that the more people there are, the less sustainable repression can become over the long term, or at least the more costly it is over the long term. And so the disruptive potential of very large numbers, again, is one of the key advantages of nonviolent campaigns over violent ones. So we also found, looking beyond just the kind of terminal success of the campaigns, at what the countries look like in the aftermath. And we found actually that the campaigns that relied primarily on nonviolent resistance were associated with like a 10 times higher rate of successful democratization within a very short time after the campaign was over. And that there was also a lower likelihood of civil conflict recurrence, meaning that within a decade of the end of the campaign, then the campaigns in which there'd been, or the countries in which there'd been a nonviolent struggle, there was like a 15% reduction in the probability that the country would break out into civil war. And the reason we were interested in those two variables was not because we think there's necessarily anything innately superior about democracy as like the end-all be-all, but in fact, many of the campaigns were themselves like asking for a transition to democracy. And so it was one way that we could look beyond just the immediate departure of a dictator and try to assess whether they actually then had some qualitative effect on the nature of the governing system. And I think it's fairly easy to justify the focus on civil conflict recurrence, just because many people that have criticized mass uprisings in the past have said that they just destabilize systems and lead to total chaos, anarchy, and turmoil. And what we find is actually that's the opposite, that armed struggles do indeed lead to conflict traps that are really difficult to escape for various reasons, whereas nonviolent struggles have a much lower risk of producing those results. Okay, so let me talk about the three primary objections that have come up to this basic claim and then what the data tell us about these today. So the first thing that a lot of people bring up is that they hate the fact that we dichotomize nonviolent and violent resistance. And I also hate it. And it is what it is. The data are out there. People can grab it, recode it, do whatever they want with it. Please do. But we, for our initial cut at the data, really wanted to evaluate that particular claim, and so made a lot of judgment calls in the data. The second big argument out there is that the way that we code success, that is the sort of terminal removal of a leader or territorial independence, is too immediate and doesn't actually look at the transformative dimensions of the movement or the campaign's potential. And also that it's narrowly defined and assessed in a way to where we can't kind of move beyond potential explanations for why these outcomes might have happened other than the movement itself. So this is actually related in some part to the argument that the onset of campaigns, or certain types of campaigns, and the outcomes are endogenous to one another, and that it's basically impossible to disentangle onset from outcome. Outcomes are overdetermined, and it's basically impossible to assess success. And then the third objection is the potential for reverse causality. particularly the argument that there are some systems that are simply too repressive, or the political opportunities are simply too minimal for nonviolent resistance to be a potential kind of source of change. There's been a lot of research since our book came out about different kind of gradations of nonviolent, violent, and in between categories. Kurt Schock and I have a paper that was published in Mobilization a year and a half ago that actually looks at those middle of the road categories. And we use, again, a fairly high threshold because we're using the NAVCO data. So the contemporaneous armed challenges are basically armed groups that have used violence that has killed at least 25 people. So that's a fairly high threshold of violent flanks. But on the other hand, all of the cases that we have in the NAVCO data set are maximalist cases. So you can imagine that a higher threshold is appropriate. And what we found is that the average nonviolent campaign with a violent flank is smaller than the average nonviolent campaign without one. We also found that those nonviolent campaigns with violent flanks had a reduced success rate. And we think that there are other articles that have come out recently that help us to understand why. One is by Elizabeth Tompkins, who published a piece that argues that the use of violence by the movement tends to increase wider spread repression, particularly repression against unarmed civilians, not the rebels themselves, and that leads then to much higher risk engagement in activism that kind of reduces the number of people that are willing to be casual insurgents for the day. It discourages defections, according to Omar Wassow, who looked actually more at events data in the United States and the South during the Black insurgency of the 60s. And I can talk a little bit more about his research, but he basically argues that the appropriation of sort of violent iconography or violent behavior ended up repelling a lot of would-be allies from that movement. And then there's also an argument that it reduces the possibility of defections because security forces in particular are much less amenable to non-cooperation or defection when there's a violent flank associated with the nonviolent movement. The other thing is there are longer-term consequences, of course, to having violent flanks, which lots of research has shown predispose societies to more kind of regressive authoritarian polities, higher risk of mass civil conflict within a decade, and a higher risk of mass killings in the short and long term, which is work I have in progress with Evan Perkowski. The second argument kind of launched against our study is that that the focus on success is too narrow and it's too immediate. So in other words, there's this argument that that the incumbent leader leaving might not mean anything. There could be a reshuffling of the deck. If you think about Egypt 2013, it could just be that there was an actual popular coup that wouldn't necessarily be associated with outcomes that many human rights watchers would prefer. And so I would just point out that Maria and I, we studied a couple of longer term outcomes in our book in a late chapter. But other people have also looked into questions about quality of life, kind of economic system change and other things related to the post-nonviolent campaign uprising question. So Judith Stoddard, who's one of Kurt Schock's students at Rutgers, wrote her dissertation looking at the effects of nonviolent versus violent campaigns on some 12 different indicators related to human development. Some to pull out are things like life expectancy and infant mortality rates relative to the global average, which are decent indicators of quality of life in many countries. And she finds overwhelming evidence that in countries in which there has been a nonviolent campaign, there's a much higher performance on all of these measures. Actually, the only measure in which there's worse performance for nonviolent campaigns than for violent campaigns is foreign direct investment. And this is actually a really important finding, a negative finding, because there's long been an argument that in countries in which there's been a nonviolent campaign, there's much more likely to be kind of a neoliberal attack on the country's economy and sort of a pulling open of the markets. And actually, it turns out that that does happen after violent campaigns and coups, but actually most of the campaigns in our data set are fairly left-leaning, progressive, like labor union-oriented movements that are not super friendly to foreign corporations and powers coming in and prying open markets and exploiting labor. There's also studies out there that I'm working on with Evan Perkosky and with Connor Sale, looking at propensities for mass killings that are retaliatory in nature toward populations, and also different measures of gender equity in the aftermath of different campaigns that do or don't have high rates of women's participation. Other studies reconceptualize success, so they use different levels of analysis and different types of data, events data, for example, to look at success. So Emiliano Hewitt-Vaughan has looked at labor concessions in France. Tricia Olson and I have looked at concessions by corporations to local groups around what they see as human rights violations by the corporations. Omar Wassow has looked at voting behavior. There are lots of other well-known papers to this crowd, I'm sure, on things like concessions extracted from strikes and other things. I guess the overall point here is that we can be more confident in findings when, with different databases, different sets of scholars who don't know each other, and different units of analysis, the directionality of the relationship points in the same direction. And then there's this issue about reverse causality and endogeneity, which actually is really tricky because endogeneity, basically there's a couple of different approaches to it. One is using instrumental variables, kind of two-stage modeling. Another is using matching approaches or propensity score matching. Another is using quasi-experimental methods or randomized controlled studies. All of these have a really serious set of constraints, both ethical and practical, associated with them. One of the major constraints for the study of nonviolent mass uprisings in particular is that studies that have tried to isolate the structural causes of nonviolent mass uprisings as a particular phenomenon have found that it's incredibly unpredictable. So this is theoretical work by Timur Kurin, but also Jay Ohlfelder and I have a paper that just came out in the Journal of Conflict Resolution, where what we do is we take all of the different kind of core models like political process, grievance-based models, modernization theory, resource mobilization, political opportunity, and a combined model that pulls together all of the different covariates associated with those approaches. And we find that none of them really predicts the onset of nonviolent uprisings very well. And in fact, the one that performs the best is the political opportunity approach, but in the opposite direction of what you'd expect. So where political opportunities are fewer and repression is higher is when we're more likely to see these nonviolent uprisings. So what I want to do to just sort of wrap it up is talk a little bit about today, what the data tell us through 2014. There are really three big takeaways from the data between 2007 and 2014, which is the new data set that we'll launch this summer for your taking. The first is that nonviolent resistance has increased in its frequency in a pretty dramatic way over the past 50 years. And this is the most prolific decade on record since 1900 in terms of mass nonviolent uprisings. The second thing is that the relative success rates of nonviolent and violent resistance remain incredibly similar in this kind of post-2006 phase, as they did in the entire series between 1900 and 2006. And this is important because I can't tell you how many times a day I hear people tell me that the Arab Spring has blown up our study. It has not. And then the third argument is really important, though, which is that the absolute success rates for both nonviolent and violent resistance have declined in the past few years. So here's the onset data. As you'll see, these data stop in 2014, where we code ongoing cases through today as failed, actually, for the purposes of being highly skeptical of the overall aggregate statistics. But basically, if we updated these data through today, at least preliminarily, our onsets are well above 55 in the current decade. So clearly, as I mentioned, we're in the most prolific decade of record since 1900. The aggregate success rates, as I mentioned, are remarkably similar to what Maria and I found in our 2011 book. There's no statistical difference in terms of significance or substance. However, in the 2007 to 2014 stage, you can see that there has been an absolute decline in the success rates of both nonviolent and violent resistance. I think there are a number of reasons why this could be going on. I also think it's a little bit too early to call it a trend because it's only a few years long and we have a lot of ongoing cases, like some 30 ongoing cases that haven't resolved yet, and so it may not actually stick. But needless to say, when we look at these cases of 2007 to 2014, there are, in terms of kind of their qualitative characteristics, there are a lot of consistencies with what we argued made civil resistance work in the earlier period, because these campaigns have built large and diverse participation. They tend to use tactical innovations and rely on a variety of nonviolent methods rather than just protest after protest. They tend to elicit loyalty shifts. They tend to maintain discipline despite the escalation of repression. So with that, I'll simply say that we are absolutely always open to further refinement and to be completely proved wrong. At the moment, the data seem to be telling us a fairly consistent story, and this is especially true because there are lots of scholars who are doing lots of research using their own data sets they collected themselves that seem to reinforce rather than undermine our findings. There are also a couple that, like people like Fabrice Lehoux who wrote a critical article in Comparative Politics that came out a few months ago, where he argues that we missed a bunch of cases in Latin America, in NAVCO, for example, and so I sort of went back with Pauline Moore here, and we looked at the cases he mentioned, and they didn't fit our inclusion criteria. So I think one of the things that's really important is to sort of be really serious about expanding the universe of cases that we're analyzing, and that's something we're doing, because it's not yet clear the degree to which these aggregate statistics and findings apply to cases outside the population we're discussing here. But I do think that the core logics of why these campaigns have succeeded or failed probably do apply quite easily to cases outside, in part because much of your own research on social movements seems to be fairly consistent with those insights. So with that, I will stop now. Thank you.